to directly answer your question, I agree with Mr. Mesereau. He said it really perfectly. I mean, you're right. There's an arbitrary nature to the death penalty.
Right.
Certain people in different states commit the same crime. There's arbitrary and get a death penalty in one state and not in another. There's certainly a broad discretion with the prosecutors of who is charged with death and who isn't. And he's right about the mistakes in the system. There have been several, and Mr. Scheck, who he referenced in the Innocence Project, and there's other people doing great work all across the country in post-conviction relief, are showing that there are actually innocent people on death row, and in some cases that has been too late. That has been found out too late, and we had a case in Arizona that I'm somewhat familiar with, the Crone case, a man who was absolutely innocent and had spent several years on death row. He was convicted with faulty evidence, and evidence that the prosecutors knew was false, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into Duke Lacrosse, but those are certainly at least some of the reasons why I oppose the death penalty.
Yeah, absolutely. And your take of how, like I told you, but you actually heard it with your own ears, that Tom Mesereau and his glowing report card for you and your partner.
Well, I mean, like I said, I appreciate the kind words that both attorneys laid out, particularly Mr. Mesereau. He seemed to understand, like few others did, that in that position we had to take some risks to save her life. And I talked about, lawyering in my book. I talk about lawyering in a different kind of way than I normally would. And I've talked about this in other interviews about the Nurmi 2.0 label that was put on me at the second trial was more how I typically lawyer, but I had to come up with a strategy in order to save Miss Arias' life and lawyer a slightly different way, and that's what I did.
Now, recently, you were in my the paper that I covered WWE for, saying Donald Trump is the new Jodi Arias, says her defense attorney, Kirk Nurmi. Can you tell us what you meant without getting into the whole article in a nutshell?
Sure. I mean, I talk a little bit about the reality TV flavor or aspect to these people, about the personas, and about how people are compelled to look, how when Jodi Arias was on trial, everything she said and did was scrutinized and discussed on social media and talked about on cable news. The same can be said for Donald Trump. He's not talking about substantive issues. He's throwing water around the stage. He's doing all sorts of things. And we look, right? We pay attention is what I keep saying in the article. All this ridiculousness, yet we pay attention. And so I kind of make that link that this is the person that's kind of filling the gap in social media and society's conscious. And then when this phenomenon is over, it'll be something else.
Absolutely. And you also spoke to the Daily News, evidently, and you said a little bit here, about these reality TV shows that the court system is allowing high-profile trials basically to turn into reality TV shows, and you weren't too much for that, and that was in the Daily News article. Can you explain a little what you meant in that article?
Well, you're going back. Yeah, I started working as a freelance writer for the New York Daily News several weeks back, I guess, a couple months back, sometime in February.
Wow,
that was my.
This is February 8th.
That was my first article, and I don't consider it so much an indictment. I consider it a questioning, because we have to decide or have to be concerned as a society about the ideals and where trials stand in our society? And are they pristine events that that have life-altering consequences for the participants, or are they reality TV shows? And we see in many cases how they almost become more of take on a reality TV life. And I think that happened in Miss Arias' case. I think that happened to some degree in Miss Anthony's case. We saw, and I know we're going to talk about O.J. Simpson later, but I think social media wasn't there yet. But we see now that the O.J. Simpson trial is now a TV event. It's now a mini-series. And so I think the point of my article was kind of as a cautionary tale to say, look, the courts need to decide where and this is going to wind up, where the line's going to be drawn, and how we can make sure that trials stay pristine events. Because if you or someone that you cared about was on trial, you would not want their trial to become a reality TV event. You would want it to be treated as the serious, life-altering situation that it is. And that was my point in that article.
Right. Okay. Yes. And you make an excellent point. And just to touch on the O.J. Simpson, the People versus O.J. Simpson, it will be its final week. I made no bones. I'm into it, and I do feel bad for all the families, but it is riveting TV. It is very interesting to see how well they have portrayed Johnny Cochran and Marcia Clark, and I look back at some of the YouTubes from the 90s, and they really did a good job of covering it, and they really did a good job of getting all that DNA stuff, not so just like in a couple of clips, but people on Twitter they're saying, like, I've heard I'm addicted and things like that. So do we blame people like that are watching it, or do we blame the people that? I mean, you know what I mean? How do you look at it from that standpoint? Because it is good on one hand, but what you're saying on the other hand also makes valid points.
Well, I think, first of all, I don't necessarily know that it's a matter of blame. I mean, we can't be upset that people are interested in watching this. The question is the extent and the degree. I mean, you're watching now a mini-series in O.J. Simpson of a trial that happened, 20 years ago, 21 years ago going on. And that mini-series isn't affecting the outcome. It's not altering any of the witnesses. It's not doing anything of that nature. But
can you say that it's educating people on the law and certain aspects of the law, like when they show? First of all, have you seen the show?
I got to admit, I don't see the show because, the last thing I want to watch when I come home is more legal drama.
It's amazing.
That is my 9 to 5.
The lawyers
Jordan.
that I talk to, they either hate it or they love it. There's no in between, and it's interesting because they really have what's his name there, the first attorney that was for O.J., who's played by John Travolta. They really make him look bad in this series, and it's based on a book. But what I did see, and I didn't appreciate, and I didn't know until recently, was on Dr. Phil. The Goldmans were never even told about this, let alone a little paycheck for their troubles or what have you. I thought that was out of bounds, personally. Not even a note, nothing.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's no rules on that. There's no restraint on that. And, you're right. I mean, while it's not affecting the trial, it could possibly affect, most importantly, the Goldmans. I've heard Marcia Clark, who frankly wasn't kind to me during the Arias trial, talk about, she's reliving a nightmare. And I have a lot of sympathy for her in that regard, because here it is years later, and this trial is being brought up, and this series is brought up, and bad memories are being brought up, things that she would probably rather not have to experience. And I'm sure that's the case for the Goldmans as well. But it is a tough line. It is a tough line, and one of the things that I think about is kind of where I look at drawing that line is the things that affect the trial while they're happening. That's my concern.
Right. And there's victims, there's victim family, there's a whole bunch of consideration, and you definitely bring an excellent point. Okay, now 10 years ago, we had the Duke case, and everybody thought, a lot of pundits on TV thought that the outcome was going to go one way, and the evidence just really wasn't there. Let's hear some of it from 10 years ago, and we'll talk on the other side.
Stephen Miller, Executive Director of the Duke Conservative Union, you have been outspoken on this case from the start. Do you still give her the benefit of the doubt? I don't think you ever did you?
Well, I never gave her the benefit of the doubt. If you looked at the evidence in its totality, it was clear from very early on in this case that this was indeed a bogus case. And Jane, I think both you and I can agree that all the charges should be dropped. This is absolutely unbelievable. On the night in question, just that night alone, she had several different versions of events. In one version of events that night, she claimed she was only groped and not even raped. She changed the number of attackers. In the photo lineup, she identified different people. She identified one of the people as having a mustache who didn't even have a mustache. This whole case has been wrought with irregularities and nonsense and deceptions. Mike Nifong keeping exculpatory evidence away from the defense. You're talking about a guy that did 70 press interviews, used it to get reelected. There was never any real evidence against these players. The DNA didn't match on any count in any way, in any capacity this entire time. You have absolutely no reason to believe these players committed this crime. One of the players has a solid alibi during the time the crime was supposed to have occurred. You've got all this stuff. I cannot think of one case of equivalent or near profile in the United States of America where there's been so little reason for three people or one person or anybody to be brought to trial. This is insanity. And I'll say this. The one person, again, who without question has behaved in an unethical, immoral, and sinister fashion is District Attorney Mike Nifong. He's pursued a case not because of the evidence, but in spite of the evidence. And the idea that in America you would pursue a case against three people when the evidence suggests not that they did it, but that they didn't do it, to me is beyond unconscionable.
Well, and I want to go to Stephen Miller of the Conservative Union for the big picture here, because you could argue that if she's making this up, people have a tendency to want to get even when racial slurs are uttered at them, and that the ugliness began with those slurs. Your thoughts on that? Because I know you're saying that does not fairly represent Duke, and I certainly agree, but this ugliness came from somewhere. It did happen. Those slurs were uttered.
Well, it doesn't fairly represent Duke. It also doesn't fairly represent the lacrosse team because, first of all, we're talking about a few individuals that are alleged to have said these things. But the three players that are on that have been indicted, that are about to face trial, are not the ones that are supposed to have said these things. The majority of the players on the team, no one's accused them of saying anything racist. So you can't take a brush and paint the whole team because of what a few people said, which is heinous, but doesn't reflect on the team as a whole. That would be absolutely absurd. And
I'm not doing that, but what I'm saying is that we talk about this horrible situation and this racially polarizing situation, and it stemmed from those words. And people say, oh, words are meaningless, but words count. Words count a lot, and they can create a lot of tragedy.
Words do count a lot, and there's no question. Let me tell you something. If somebody said to a black person or an Asian person or a Jewish person or any person, something like that, and I was around, I would put them in their place because there's no place for that in America.